Let's learn about the overlay blend mode. Overlay is an interesting blend mode because it can brighten or darken depending on the situation. To see how this works, let's compare overlay to multiply and screen. To do this, I'm just going to add a new fill layer. And then I'm going to make this layer darker, so a nice dark gray like that. Then we can go ahead and turn on the multiply blend mode. So as we've already learned, multiply will combine the darknesses from both layers to create a darker image. And even if we make the fill layer brighter, it will still darken the image because even a light shade of gray has a little bit of darkness in it. And if we change the blend mode to screen, then the photo becomes very bright because it combines the brightness from both layers. And even if we make this layer darker, it will still brighten the image because even a dark shade of gray still has some brightness in it. Okay, but now let's see how this compares to overlay. Overlay has made the image a lot darker because we're using a dark gray layer. But if I make this layer a light shade of gray, then it will brighten the image. But why is that? Why does overlay sometimes brighten the image and sometimes darken it? Well, to see why, let's take a look at these 5 squares, which range from pure black to pure white. To understand how overlay works, you need to know what its goal is. The goal of overlay is to make your photo black or white. Overlay loves both of these extremes, and it's willing to push your photo towards either one of them, depending on whether you give it a dark or light layer to work with. So if you add a dark layer, like a fill layer with 25% luminosity, then overlay will make your image darker. Since you added a dark layer, overlay assumes you want your overall image to be darker, so it pushes everything closer to black. But if you add a light layer, like one with 75% luminosity, then overlay will make your image brighter. Since you added a bright layer, overlay assumes you want the overall image to be brighter, so it pushes everything closer to white. But what if you add a layer that's not bright or dark? What would overlay do to a layer that has 50% luminosity? 50% gray is actually a special color for overlay because overlay doesn't know what to do with it. It can't decide if you want to make the photo brighter or darker. So if you use overlay on 50% gray, then nothing will happen. So to summarize what we just learned, using overlay on a bright layer will make your photo brighter, while using overlay on a dark layer will make your photo darker. And if you use overlay on a neutral layer of 50% gray, then nothing will happen. Okay, now let's jump back into Affinity to see how all of this works in practice. As we saw before, making this layer darker will darken the image, and making it lighter will brighten the image. But if we make it a neutral 50% gray, then you can see it has no effect with the overlay blend mode. That's all easy enough, but now I want to really test your understanding of overlay. First, I'm going to duplicate our photos layer by pressing Command J on a Mac or Control J on a PC. Okay, now for your review question. I want you to figure out what will happen if we use overlay on this duplicate photo. Will it make the overall image brighter? Darker? Do nothing? I'll give you a second to think about it. All right, now let's go ahead and turn on overlay to see what happens. Now if I turn the layer on and off, you can see that our image is both brighter and darker. To see why this is, let's take a look at a couple of specific areas. First, let's look at her shirt. In the original photo, her shirt was already quite dark, definitely darker than 50% gray. So on the duplicate photo, Overlay applied a darkening effect to this area, since Overlay will use anything darker than 50% gray to darken the image. So that's why this duplicate photo made her shirt even darker. Now to contrast that, the sky in this photo is very bright, much brighter than 50% gray. So on the duplicate photo, Overlay applied a brightening effect to this area, since Overlay will use anything brighter than 50% gray to brighten the image. In other words, the bright areas of the photo have become brighter, and the dark areas of the photo have become darker. Or even more simply put, Overlay has increased the contrast of the image. That's why Overlay isn't considered a brightening blend mode or a darkening blend mode, but it's actually considered a contrast blend mode. In fact, Overlay is really useful for adding contrast because of another trait that it has. Overlay is a special blend mode because it will brighten highlights faster than it will brighten up the shadows in your image. And it will darken shadows faster than it will darken highlights in your image. This allows you to brighten your highlights without affecting your shadows too much, or to darken your shadows without affecting your highlights too much. To see how this works, I'm going to delete this duplicate photo layer that we made earlier. And then I'm going to add a gradient to this fill layer. So I'm just going to click and drag from one side to the other. I'm going to leave this color stop set to black, and I'm going to change this one to white. Now, if you look at the right side of the photo, you can see that this black gradient is making the shadows much darker without affecting the highlights too much. So you can see the trees have become almost black, while the highlights in the sky are still nice and bright. And if you look over on the left side, you can see the opposite is true. The sky, the grass, and her skin have all gotten much brighter. But this dark shadow in the trees is still very dark. That's why Overlay is such a great blend mode for brightening or darkening a photo, because most of the time, you'll want to brighten up your highlights without affecting the shadows too much, or darken your shadows without affecting the highlights too much. Okay, that's pretty much all you need to know, but before we finish this video, I want to mention one last thing. We've been using Overlay throughout this video, but there's another blend mode that's very similar to Overlay, and that's the Soft Light blend mode. All you need to know is that Soft Light is a less intense version of Overlay. So it works the same as Overlay, except it brightens highlights less quickly and darkens shadows less quickly too. Some people like the extreme contrast that Overlay makes, but other people prefer the softer appearance of Soft Light. Both of these blend modes are great, and depending on the photo, one of them might work better than the other, so feel free to try using both of them. And with that, we're done. Now you have everything you need to work with Overlay and Soft Light. We'll practice these blend modes later on in the course, but for now, let's move on to the next video, where I need to tell you a little secret about blend modes.